Hello, everybody. I hope you guys are all prayed up because we're going to continue our lecture on God as a Man of War by Father Stephen D. Young. And as I alluded to in the first video, the reason why we want to continue onward and go through some of the chapters is to provide clarifying points. The clarifying points I'm hoping will be like guideposts. I'm hoping that it will work something like context in our minds and our attitudes when it comes to justice to help us have balance, but also to have the right understanding, the correct understanding of the correct picture, let's say, of God's justice. And so today we're going to be going over some of the finer points. I'm going to read a couple quotes from chapter 1. Chapter 1 is titled Divine Justice. And we're going to see some interesting clarifying points. Like I said, we're going to see the way justice is appointed in creation. We'll see talk of justice within the earth, the ground, within creation itself. And we're going to see harmony between Old and New Testament views of justice. So I'll start with the quote from chapter 1. It's on page 13. Father Stephen D. Young opens, he says, "Much of the violence found in scriptures is nested within language of justice, including language of punishment. In some cases, the violent justice comes at the hands of humans appointed to administer justice, judges and kings. In other cases, it is administered by God directly, as when Sodom and Gomorrah were consumed by fire, or the plagues fell on Egypt. Suffering, destruction, and death befall people in the world as a response to injustice or is motivated by the justice of God. These Old Testament images culminate in the series of disturbing scenes of darkness and doom that unfold in St. John's Revelation before the Last Judgment." There he tells us really what he's going to talk about, everything we need to know. So is justice sort of this idea, especially in Christianity, is it sort of like this rebellious, we have to rise up against injustice? No, we don't see like a rebellious attitude. We see the opposite. We see God as holding appointed offices, judges and kings together with his providence. He holds kings in the hands of his providence. And so we see his justice can flow down from human beings, right? And that shows us that justice is an energy from God. It's something that we can play a role in if we're repentant. However, it's not something that we sort of appoint upon ourselves, but rather it's something that's appointed to us. It's a gift, and this is important because if it were otherwise, right, if we could self-appoint to start wars or self-appoint to have justice on these grander, larger scales, then it would be easy for us to sort of do it based on our fallen will rather than doing it based off of some kind of calling from God's will. And so, on page 17, he supports exactly what I'm saying. And then he's also going to make another interesting point. So pay attention. God's justice is also one of the divine energies. God is just and is continuously working in his creation to bring about and preserve this state of justice. Therefore, for a human person or community to live in accordance with divine justice is to participate in his operation in creation. This participation is transformative and produces a state of blessing. To bless, as a verb, is then to bring the person or thing blessed into alignment with God and His purposes in creation. Likewise, for a human person or a human community to live in a way that is unjust, that is, that runs against how God works within His created order, is to produce corruption. This state of rebellion is deformative and results in a state of curse. When someone or something is cursed, it is removed from the system of relationships that constitute justice in the world. So, Cain, after committing murder, was cursed from the earth and no longer able to work the land to bring forth food through agriculture. That's in Genesis chapter 4. Throughout the Old Testament, curse entails banishment from community and the place where God dwells. So we learn there, not only does God's justice flow down through appointment, an office, let's say, but it's also emanant inside of creation itself. And so to be in a state of blessing is to be sort of not at odds with God's intentions and purposes in creation, in the natural order. But to be in a state of curse is to be in a contradictory, rebellious state. You could say swimming upstream, right? From swimming upstream against the current of God's divine justice in His creation. And a great example, a scriptural example, is Genesis 4, like he mentions, because among other places, Genesis 4 shows us an interesting aspect of Cain's cursing, right, is that he's cursed from the ground. He's unable to till the land. His work in the land is unable to bring forth fruit. And this seems to be a kind of natural consequence of his work from start to finish, his sacrifice, the way he conducted himself, getting the first fruits of his harvest, right? It may even be related to all the way back from there. It's not just Cain's murder, right? It's the story from start, middle to finish that produces this state of curse in Cain. A core aspect of that is murdering Abel, his brother, and the blood from Abel is spilt, and it falls onto the ground, right? And it cries out to God for vengeance, as it were. And so he's cursed from the ground. And I'm not saying that God doesn't also sort of give him a sort of punishment, but it's because he's cursed from the ground that he becomes a sojourner and he is exiled from the ground. And he goes on, his generations produce civilization. Cain's generation, right, in response to failing at agriculture, they invent weapons of war, they invent tools, and they invent civilization, which is seemingly built on a kind of stealing murderous principle. So that's where we see, right? God's energy is eminent in creation itself, and when we violate that, when we shed blood or when we taint the land with our improper sacrifices, right? When we taint the land with our improper sacrifices, then all of a sudden we are pushed back. We're almost pushed away. We're pushed away by the eminent justice, the eminent intentionality of God's creation. And so that gives us some clarifying points. We also have a different clarifying point that, again, adds refinement to our understanding. So he has a section called Father of the Fatherless and Protector of Widows. And this is where he talks about the aim of God's restoration, right? What does he seek to restore to victims of injustice? So on page 21, he says, "It is impossible to establish or restore justice without taking a side, or, perhaps more appropriately, taking up a cause. In particular, justice requires taking up the cause of the victims of injustice. It requires setting oneself against the perpetrators of the injustice in question. This kind of stance will naturally favor victims and call for action against their oppressors. Action that the scriptures always refer to as a punishment for their crimes, whether it takes the form of restitution, exile, or even the death penalty." And we'll get later in other chapters, okay, where's this death penalty coming from, right? Well, it's coming from the state, which has the sword. The state has the monopoly of violence, you could say. And so, as he states in the first chapter, right, sometimes God's justice flows down through officials, you could say. In the scriptures, reflecting the milieu of the ancient Near East, the archetypal social categories of the weak and oppressed are orphans and widows. And he cites some scriptures to back that up. And then he says, Yahweh is the father of the fatherless and protector of widows. Quoting the Psalm 68 or 67, depending on which version you use. So there we don't see, right, this kind of modern idea of justice, which is moderation. Two people have a disagreement. I'm going to come in and I'm going to mediate the disagreement. And I'm going to basically assume in this mediation that both sides are equally responsible. And you'd be surprised, that's actually a very common attitude I've found in people. But that's not what Stephen DeYoung is saying. Stephen DeYoung is saying in this book that actually justice is to take up a cause against the unrighteous for the sake of the righteous, right? So it entails taking a side. And it even has sort of a social level of a kind of social justice, not in the leftist progressive super gay way, but the kind of social justice that helps the abused. It helps the abused become restored back to their former state before they were essentially hurt, you know. And then there's a small little last section I'll go over where he just briefly discusses an interesting point that I also think has a refining effect on our attitude. When talking of God's mercy, he actually says in here that God's mercy or God's wrath or punishment, I'll just read it here. God's judgment, wrath, or punishment is really his allowing the perpetrators of iniquity to experience the full consequences of their sin. And so this indicates, as he indicates elsewhere in this chapter, that even for sinners, there is some kind of protection that God is yielding to them. But there's a certain point where the cost of protecting the sinner starts to outweigh or weigh on, let's say, the damages and the cause of the person who is being harmed by the sin. And in those scenarios, you start to see God lifting the protection of the consequence, taking away, basically letting the full consequences, as Stephen DeYoung says, letting the full snapback happen, letting the wicked experience the fruits of their own labor, the wages of their sin, which is death, right? And he talks about it in the book further later. We won't go into it in depth because this video is getting long. But basically, in Scripture, God desires the repentance of the perpetrators as well as restoration for the victims. And so there's kind of this trade-off relationship there sometimes. But ultimately, God's divine justice is inscrutably able to balance both. It's inscrutably able to know what is best for the perpetrator, while also actually inflicting justice and punishment on perpetrators for the sake of the victims. So I think there's some interesting things we can learn from that. It flows nicely into the next chapter, which is titled The Nature of Death, which I hope you guys will come along with me as we continue to refine our points of view, our attitudes, in the next video. So that's God's divine justice. That is some of the context and the refinement from the first chapter. And I hope that you guys found this video useful. And I'll see you all in the next one.